Before I begin my contribution, I will also join my colleagues in welcoming and congratulating the two new members of the Chamber, the member for Huon and the member for Rosevears. It was lovely to hear the inaugural contribution from the member for Huon today, and I certainly look forward to hearing from the member for Rosevears in times to come and getting to know you both better as colleagues in the Chamber. Welcome. Mr President, I'm going to begin. I'd like to thank the member for Murchison for bringing this motion for debate. Family violence is certainly an important topic for us to give our consideration to, as its impact really pervades our community. And I would begin by acknowledging any people here today and those in the Tasmanian community who are affected by family violence, those who are victims and survivors, those who are witnesses and allies, and those who provide support and assistance. The member for Murchison has provided a thorough discussion of this issue and the points covered by the motion. I support the motion fully, and I'll add my thoughts on a few of the matters that it covers. Something I'm inserting into my contribution just now, though, having listened to my colleagues and their contributions, is something I've noted, Mr President, as I listened, and that's that we use a lot of figures in relation to this topic, a lot of data. And generally the figures we quote are victim-focused. 1 in 4 women, 1 woman a week, and the like. I think this in itself tells us something, because if we talk about and prompt each other to think about the fact that 1 in 4 women we may know are experiencing family violence or have experienced family violence, we must be prompted to extrapolate that and to think about the fact that potentially 1 in 4 men that we know are perpetrators of family violence. And I don't know about you, Mr President, and others here, but somehow, for me, I have to acknowledge when I say that aloud, it's much more comfortable for me to acknowledge 1 in 4 women than it is to acknowledge 1 in 4 men as perpetrators. And that's interesting. I think it's fundamental to what is underpinning this motion and what is underpinning this issue. And I think it's certainly representative of the sensitivity that's there, so that when we come to discuss this issue together, when we come to give it our consideration and our analysis, and our investment and our true commitment, we have to acknowledge the uncomfortable parts of it. We have to have the difficult conversations with ourselves and with each other to actually move forward. We can't just comfortably all share the 1 in 4 women and the 1 in 1 woman a week and nod our heads and shake our heads and feel bad about that. We have to also find a way to talk about, and even more importantly, to put figures to, accurate figures, honest figures, purposeful figures, to the however many in 4, however many in 10, however many men in our community are on the other side of this equation who are the active perpetrators of this issue. Until we do that, we are still putting barriers in front of us, making genuine progress. We are still focusing on the wrong end of the equation. And we will still be talking about this issue for who knows how much longer into the future, until we have that difficult conversation. And I think that that leads into the things that I would like to say further about this motion, and that's, Mr President, that violence against women occurs in the social context of gender inequality. It's not inevitable. It's preventable. As a community, we can work to prevent violence against women by addressing the gender inequality that exists. And I think it's important to emphasise that this is not something that will happen naturally. It is not something that will happen on its own. It is something that must be done, Mr President, through active, thoughtful work, so that we can undo the patterns that are set, so that we can address the unconscious biases that we all hold from our socialisation. And I would pin that to that more comfort in discussing the women experiencing violence than the comfort in talking about men perpetrating it. So the unconscious biases, so that we can also address those more overt forms also of discrimination that are still held by many and acted on by many in our community. The member for Murchison has already mentioned Jess Hill's book, published this year, titled See What You Made Me Do, and I reiterate the member's encouragement to all who have not yet read it to read that book. In it, Ms Hill explains why she prefers the term domestic abuse rather than domestic or family violence. And it's partly because of the use of the word violence puts the focus on physical assault and physical harm. But we know that the vast majority of domestic abuse which is occurring is not physical violence. It's almost like an iceberg. With the physical violence, the very small tip that's perhaps most visible, while the great mass of domestic abuse is actually below the surface. It's harder to see. It's the controlling behaviour, it's the emotional abuse, the threats, the coercion, the psychological damage, the financial and social control. These are the behaviours that have a life-limiting impact on victims, that frees them in their potential to fully live and express their own identity and sense of self and pursuit of life and happiness. These are the behaviours that find fertile ground in our more broadly held attitudes around gender and the inequality that's embedded in those attitudes. Some of the damaging societal attitudes and patterns that we need to dismantle, Mr President, include things such as rigid gender roles and stereotypes about men and women. And as a small anecdote, sometimes these things aren't really obvious hits you in your face where the people overtly hold rigid gender roles. Men must go and do this, women must go and do that. It can be really subtle. It's the unconscious biases that still are there. And I'll give you an example. I had a discussion recently with a friend. We were simply observing posts on a Facebook page about sports teams relating to girls and boys. They were all on the same Facebook page, and the little comments about the games of the week. And we just noted the difference in language used in the descriptions of the children who were featured about each game. And we just noted that the language used, the verbs used, the sorts of energy in the descriptions that related to the boys who had played that weekend in the posts about the boys' teams were very forceful and active and strong and lively. And the descriptions, and it's a generalisation, but the descriptions that related to the girls and the girls' teams that had played in that same Facebook feed were less active, a little bit softer, a little bit more general, a little bit less physical and robust in the way they were described. And it was an interesting observation for my friend and I to be making together. And I think it points to the fact that this isn't always obvious. Dismantling these ideas about how we talk about boys and girls, about how we think about men and women, it's not always the obvious, overt discriminatory things. It's the very small things. They're things that you can tweak. They're things that you can think about subtly. How are we describing boys here? How are we describing girls? What messages are we giving these young people about who they are and their capacity and capability and how they should be in the world? We can do it in all sorts of ways, big and small, and that's just a small anecdote to help illustrate that point. And I'll move on. So back to, I was talking about some of the damaging societal attitudes and patterns that we need to dismantle. So moving on from that gender roles and stereotypes, we've also got to look at toxic forms of male bonding and exhibitions of aggressive masculinity that directly sort of disrespect and are hostile towards women, towards things that are regarded as feminine, and dismissive of those things, both broadly but also certainly within other males. We've got to look at social norms that place men more readily into decision-making and leadership roles and relegate women's voices into subservient roles, into less featured roles, into less heard roles. We have to look at the excuses, those excuses that are made all too readily that absolve men of responsibility when they are aggressive or abusive or even violent in their behaviour. Mr President, this motion from the member for Murchison calls for a whole-of-government, whole-of-parliament approach to raising awareness, challenging attitudes and considering law reform. I support that call, but I would add that this must be alongside a whole-of-family and whole-of-community approach also. Mr President, it's everyone's business. But to be even more pointed about where responsibility lies, it's the business of each and every one of us, every day, at home, at work, at play, and in our community. Sometimes saying it's everyone's business means that it's no one's business, and I want to be absolutely explicit that it is in fact each and every one of our business to make this change that's needed. And Mr President, it's a huge task. It is at times difficult and confronting, as I've already spoken about. It takes consideration, it takes analysis, strategic and purposeful action. And most importantly, it will also take time. Having said that, I don't believe that we've reached an appropriate level of urgency in our approach and in our actions to this issue. 36 Australian women have been killed in 2020. We've heard that numerous times today already. I believe 5 of those have been in the last 20 days. And as I mentioned earlier, the physical manifestation of violence against women, particularly homicide as its most extreme expression, is just the tip of the iceberg. Every single one of the 36 murders of Australian women this year, my partner or former partner, is abhorrent, Mr President. Every single one is an utter tragedy. Every single one is a shocking waste of life. And it must be unimaginably painful for the families and friends and communities that each of those 36 women had around them. It's the tip of the iceberg, though. It's the tip of the iceberg of that tragedy, of that shocking waste of life, and of that abhorrent reality that too many Australian and Tasmanian women are living. Mr President, the member for Murchison has spoken of the work of Our Watch, a national leader in the primary prevention of violence against women and their children in Australia. That organisation works to embed gender equality and prevent violence where Australians live, learn, work and socialise. They're an excellent organisation with excellent materials that are educative and informed. Our Watch tells us that the actions that will help prevent violence against women include challenging the condoning of violence against women, not accepting that violence against women is normal or inevitable, and challenging any social norms, structures and practices that condone or excuse it. They say that promoting women's independence and decision-making is essential, ensuring that women have access to the same resources, power and opportunities as men. They also say challenging gender stereotypes and roles, confirming that supporting children and young people and adults to develop positive personal identities free of those restrictive gender stereotypes is essential. Particularly, they highlight promoting gender equitable roles in parenting, as well as in work and other areas amongst our community. Home is important, as well as in public. They say strengthening positive, equal and respectful relationships must be part of this equation, challenging disrespectful behaviour towards women and assumptions that men should have power and control, working with children and young people to promote respect and gender equality as they are raised at home, at school and in our community. These are valuable guideposts for us in taking action going forward. But more specifically, Mr President, I would highlight the particular role that government can take to provide a better and more effective support to those who are experiencing family violence now. The section of the motion that's pertinent here is point 3E, which says, provide adequate resourcing to support the victims of family violence, predominantly women and children, to access safe shelter, financial support, social support, access to justice and legal aid, psychological and therapeutic support. Mr. President, we live in a community that has insufficient affordable housing, such that thousands experience homelessness, including thousands of women and children turned away from emergency housing services. We've heard about 2 women's services delivering emergency accommodation to Hobart women, one in the Kingston area, one in the Hobart area. 12 women a month, I think, just from the Huon region was the figure given to us by the member for Huon who are turned away. The member for Murchison mentioned, I believe it was 219 women a month turned away from the Hobart Women's Shelter. This is the stark reality of a lack of affordable housing, because we can't move women through those emergency services and into more secure, permanent accommodation by which they can escape their current situation. The number of women who can only exit emergency accommodation back into situations of violence is abhorrent and astounding in a community that claims to be civilised, that claims to be a compassionate and kind society. We also live in a community that sees women financially disadvantaged throughout their working life and in their retirement. We live in a community in which access to justice can be traumatising to women and children, and legal aid is in many times rationed, with many missing out. While I acknowledge that investment is being made by government in these areas, Mr. President, the simple reality is that it is not enough. We are not planning to actually solve this issue. We are not investing sufficiently to actually support Tasmanian women to be safe. We are not doing enough. It's as simple as that. And Tasmania is not unique in this entirely insufficient response. And indeed, state governments alone cannot be imposed upon to address this problem in isolation. Yes, it's their responsibility, but it's also a community responsibility and a national responsibility. Governments, however, should take a leadership role. And Mr. President, in early March this year, ahead of a COAG meeting of the women's safety ministers from around the country, a letter was written by the Australian Violence Against Women Alliance, AWAVA, and Fair Agenda. And it was signed, this letter, by 67 groups from around the country. And it outlined 5 clear areas to the state and federal governments from around our nation, 5 clear areas that need improvement. The 5 actions in that letter, signed by those 67 groups, were fully fund specialist services that keep women and children safe. Fully fund. To put kids' safety first in the family law system. Actually make change. To ensure those facing safety risks can be identified and correctly referred to frontline services. Have enough entry points for people to come through and then be moved on and referred to where they need to go for help. And the 5th one was improving AVO standards and ensuring that everyone's calls for help can be heard. The letter that had those 5 clear actions stated, women can't afford for this meeting to only result in more plans and promises for future action. Alongside long-term plans, we need these 5 immediate changes to urgently improve women's and children's safety. Dr Merindal Andrew, who's the Program Manager for AWAVA, said that governments can't simply point to plans that have been written as if that's all that's required in order to make women safe. She said, and I quote, "This plan isn't worth the paper it's written on if it's not matched with adequate resourcing of services and changes to the systems that perpetuate this crisis." And further, she said, "With increasing awareness of the issue and a public focus on changing attitudes, more women than ever before are seeking greater safety and support from services. Without full funding of the specialist services that women rely on to be safe, the current national plan is set on a course to fail." Mr President, that letter was written in March. The COAG Women's Safety Council has met numerous times since then, most recently this month, I believe. Those actions advocated for by dozens of groups nationally have not been taken up or funded in a meaningful way. National advocates and those in the sector estimate that current funding needs to be quadrupled to adequately address demand. Mr President, I would like to finish by acknowledging the essential and excellent work done by Tasmanian Services providing support and assistance to women and children affected by family violence. I'd like to acknowledge Relationships Australia, who provide counselling and other support to people who've experienced violence and abuse. They provide programs, groups and courses for people who have used anger, violence or abuse in their interpersonal relationships and that want to find new ways of relating to others to not harm. They run the Men Engaging New Strategies, MENS program, designed for men who've hurt or abused their partners or ex-partners and are ready to take responsibility for their behaviour. That program is specifically for men who are perpetrators of low to medium risk family violence. I'd also like to acknowledge Engender Equality. They're a statewide not-for-profit organisation that supports people affected by family and domestic violence in Tasmania. They offer counselling, face-to-face, phone and online, and they offer, importantly, education and training and advocacy for change. They're a leadership voice on this topic in this state. Mr President, I also acknowledge the Women's Legal Service Tasmania. They're a community legal service offering free statewide assistance to women. They provide advice and referral on all legal matters, including family law and family violence. I acknowledge the Hobart Women's Shelter. They specialise in issues relating to domestic and family violence, gender discrimination and homelessness as it relates to women and their children in Tasmania. The Hobart Women's Shelter are also a partner in the Mentors in Family Violence Prevention program. This is a training that promotes participants as empowered bystanders who can confront, interrupt or prevent violence. The other groups involved in delivering that program are Engender Equality, Women's Health Tasmania and the Women's Legal Service, and also the Tasmanian Community. It's funded by the Tasmanian Community Fund. I acknowledge Gyra House, which is a welcoming, supportive crisis accommodation service for women and children in Tasmania. I acknowledge Women's Health Tasmania. They are a service run by women for women. They provide counselling and a free call information line. They have a community nurse. They provide financial assistance through the Niels Loans scheme. And they also run a range of very well participated in wellbeing activities such as yoga, tai chi and meditation. I acknowledge Catholic Care, Mr President, who provide the Safe Choices program. It's a service for children and young people and adults affected by family violence. It's a non-crisis service that can help with decision-making, exit planning and practical support. Catholic Care also run the specialised family violence services for couples and individuals who are dealing with issues related to controlling, aggressive, violent or abusive behaviours in their relationships. That program provides help for all the family through a service focusing on the needs and the safety of each family member. And finally, I'd mention the Tasmanian Family Violence Counselling and Support Service. That's part of the Tasmanian Government's Safe at Home initiative. It has services available to anyone, including children and young people, who need support or information because of their partner, ex-partner or family member who is or has been violent or abusive to them. Mr President, that is not an exhaustive list of Tasmanian services that provide support in this space, and I apologise to those that I may not have mentioned, and I certainly extend my personal thanks to all those services and individuals in this state who are providing assistance and safety to Tasmanian women. Mr President, I thank the member for Murchison for highlighting this urgent and important issue, and I reiterate my full support for this motion.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. The Honourable Leader.
Thank you, Mr President. I'd like to just